Let me tell you about a man named Owen Pedersen and a piece of ground in the southeastern corner of Kansas that most people had stopped seeing a long time ago. It sat in Cherokee County, close to the Missouri line, in that stretch of prairie where the grain fields flatten out and the wind carries the sound of far things a long way. Grasshoppers in July, meadowlarks in April, and once, a long time back, the sound of a locomotive whistle 2 nights a week coming up from the south. Most folks driving through in the 1990s would have told you the trains were done in that country. Most folks would have been wrong, but Owen knew the difference, and this is a story about how a quiet man came to own 1,120 acres nobody else wanted, and what came riding up the tracks 18 months later to prove him right. Now, here's what you need to understand about Owen. He was 51 years old in the fall of 1996. He farmed 640 acres of soft winter wheat about 4 miles west of a town called Pearson, and he kept a small herd of black baldy cattle on the rougher ground along the creek. His grandfather had come over from Sweden in 1911 and taken work as a switchman on the old St. Louis and San Francisco Railway, the Frisco Line, in the yards at Pittsburgh, Kansas. His father had farmed. Owen had done both, in his own quiet way, and he was the kind of man who would sit at the coffee counter in Pearson on a Saturday morning without saying much of anything for an hour, and then leave a $5 bill under his cup and go home. But here's the part that matters. Owen had an uncle. His uncle's name was Halvard Pedersen, his father's older brother, and Halvard had worked 31 years as a rail dispatcher for the Frisco out of the Pittsburgh station, from 1948 until 1979. Halvard had never married. He had lived alone in a small brick house on North Broadway with a coal stove and a shelf full of hardbound journals. When he passed in the winter of 1988 at the age of 73, he left almost nothing to anyone. A small savings account, a Buick station wagon, a pocket watch, and to his nephew Owen, he left 14 leather-bound journals and 1 manila folder tied shut with cotton string. The journals were what Halvard had kept, in his own square patient handwriting, every single working day from 1948 forward. Freight tonnage moving through the yards, tariff rates by commodity, which branches had gone quiet and which had come back, and why. He wrote the way a doctor takes notes on a patient, carefully, without hurry, on the assumption that someone someday was going to need the record, and in the manila folder was something else. It was a private study Halvard had put together in the spring of 1978. 48 pages, unpublished, that he had intended to submit to an internal railroad commission looking at the future of secondary lines in the Middle West. He never submitted it. The commission was folded before he finished, but the study was complete, and Owen had read it slowly 3 times in the years since Halvard's funeral. Now, there were 3 things in particular that Halvard had figured out about that country, and Owen had come to trust every one of them. The first was that the old Frisco spur running due east through Cherokee County, past the old Ballard farm and out to the Missouri line, was not truly dead. It had been taken out of active service in 1980, when the Frisco went under and got folded into the Burlington Northern System, and eventually into BNSF. But the rails were still down, the ties were still down. And most importantly, the right-of-way itself was still held under easement by the successor railroad. Halvard had underlined it twice in his study. A spur under easement is not a spur abandoned. Reactivation, under the internal regulations Halvard had spent 30 years learning by heart, did not require new community consent. It required only a demonstrated commercial need. And that was the second thing. The second thing was the grain elevator. On the old Ballard place, right beside the spur where the rails made a slight bend around a stand of hackberry, there stood a wooden grain elevator built in 1923. It was 73 years old in the fall of 1996, and every professional appraiser who walked past it wrote it off as unsalvageable. Weathered gray, roof half gone, doors hanging crooked. But Halvard had walked out to that elevator with Owen in the summer of 1985, and he had shown him something. The concrete pad underneath was sound. The center pit was dry. The scale mechanism inside, a Fairbanks Morse platform scale, cast iron, from before the war, was still in one piece under the dust. Halvard had said, standing there with his hand flat on the boards, "You could bring this back for maybe $40,000. A new one from the ground up runs $600. Owen had remembered. The third thing was harder to explain, but it was the one Halvard cared about most. He believed that grain traffic on the American rails moved in cycles of about 8 years, tied to the export flow through the Gulf of Mexico. and that every 8 years when the export surge came, the main lines got choked, and the railroads had to reach back for their sleeping branches. Halvard had traced the pattern in his journals from 1958 forward, 1966, 1974, 1982. 3 peaks, all matching. And in the last pages of his unpublished study, in his careful square hand, Halvard had written a prediction. The next surge will fall in the crop year of 1998. Sleeping branches will wake for that surge, or be lost for a generation. That was the country next to Owen's fence. That was what Owen knew. And on a cold overcast Tuesday in November of 1996, Silas Ballard, who had been a friend of Owen's father, lost 1,120 acres of that country at a foreclosure auction held in a canvas tent, set up on his own barnyard, with the wind coming down flat across the prairie and everyone in the tent buttoning their coats. But that's not what this story is really about. Rail lines in the American Midwest went through a long contraction from the 1970s onward, as bankruptcies, mergers, and highway competition drove thousands of miles of secondary track out of active service. Many of these lines were not formally abandoned. They remained under easement with the ties and rails in place, waiting for a shift in freight economics that industry insiders knew would eventually return. Local farmers who lived beside these dormant spurs often understood their true status better than distant investors reading only the official service maps. Part 2. Now, let me tell you who showed up to buy that farm. The company was called Meridian Grain Partners, out of Kansas City, formed in 1993 to take advantage of exactly this kind of distressed property. Small farms near failing rail infrastructure, priced at 15 to 20 cents on the dollar, restructured around trucking, and sold on to larger operators within 5 years. They had capital. They had a regional director named Douglas Ramsey, 44 years old, an MBA from Wharton, the specific confidence of a man who had bought and sold a lot of dirt in the Middle West and had never once loaded a grain truck himself. Underneath Douglas was his lead analyst, Rachel Ivers, 30 years old, a master's in agricultural economics from Kansas State. Smart, competent the way some young experts are competent at the standard case, less competent at the local case, and not yet aware that the two were different. Below Rachel, there were 3 junior consultants, and there was one more, a young man named Nathan Osgood, 27 years old, a logistics degree from Missouri State. Nathan had grown up on a small farm in Neosho County, 1 county south. He had ridden in his father's grain truck since he was 9. He had the humility to understand that 6 months in a Kansas City office is not long enough to know anything about the country west of Fort Scott. He kept his mouth shut and his notebook open. That habit is going to matter later. Meridian bought the old Ballard place at the auction on November 19, 1996, for $240,000, which even the auctioneer in the canvas tent looked slightly embarrassed to write down. 1,120 acres, $240,000. That comes out to something around $215 an acre in country where good farmland was moving at $900. But the property had the dead rail line running through the middle of it, and the old wooden elevator standing off to one side like a corpse nobody had bothered to bury. And Douglas Ramsey and Rachel Ivers had already sketched out their plan on the flight up from Kansas City. They would clear the elevator. They would pull up the rails on the 400 feet of spur that crossed the property to make room for a truck turnaround and a new asphalt pad. And they would build a modern steel grain elevator 4 miles closer to Highway 400, where the trucks could actually get in and out. Owen watched all of this from across the fence line. He watched the surveyors come in. He watched the demolition crew mark the wooden elevator with orange spray paint. He watched, with particular attention, the day in early February of 1997 when a small crew came out with a torch and a track wrench and pulled up 400 feet of Frisco rail, ties and all, and stacked it in a pile beside the old right-of-way. Owen was not a man who said nothing when he saw something that needed saying. He drove into Pearson on a Wednesday morning in the middle of February, parked his old Chevy pickup on the street in front of the 2-story brick building on Main that used to be the First National Bank, took off his cap, and went up the stairs to the second floor, where Meridian had set up their regional office. Douglas Ramsey was in from Kansas City that day. Rachel Ivers was there. Nathan Osgood was sitting at a small desk by the window, keeping quiet. Owen wore what he always wore into an office. Clean denim, a canvas coat, work boots wiped off on the mat downstairs. Nothing fancy but not shabby either. He was not a poor man. He was a working farmer who dressed like one. He held his cap in his hands the way his father had taught him to hold a cap inside another man's office. He told them what he knew. He told it plainly and in order. He told them about the easement on the spur and how pulling up the rails without notifying BNSF was going to become a problem when the reactivation notice came. And he said, in his even voice, that the reactivation notice was coming, most likely inside 2 years. He told them about the concrete pad under the wooden elevator and the Fairbanks Moore scale still in the pit, and how the whole thing could be brought back for less than $70,000. And he told them about the 8-year cycle in Gulf grain exports, and how the next peak was going to fall in the crop year of 1998, and how the railroads were going to be looking for every sleeping branch they could wake up. He spoke for about 17 minutes. He did not raise his voice. He did not sound dramatic. He sounded like a man giving directions. Douglas Ramsey listened with professional courtesy. He thanked Owen for coming in. He said the team had done a thorough review of the rail corridor with Union Pacific. Owen did not correct him about the difference between Union Pacific and BNSF, though he noticed, and had concluded the line was permanently out of service. Rachel Ivers looked at Owen's work-worn hands and his uncle's handwriting that existed in no format she could cite, and she said very politely that she appreciated the historical perspective, but Meridian's projections showed railborne corn exports declining through 2002, and their capital allocation was already committed to a trucking-based model. She said the wooden elevator failed the 1994 FGIS structural standards and could not be recertified. Owen looked at her for a moment. The Fairbanks Moore scale in that pit, he said, has been weighing grain since 1923. It'll pass certification on the second inspection. It's the paperwork that fails the first time, not the iron. Rachel said the industry data did not support that view. No, Owen said. It wouldn't. He thanked them for their time. He put his cap back on. He left. After he was gone, Nathan Osgood, who had not said a word during the meeting, sat at his desk by the window and opened his notebook and wrote 4 lines. Old Frisco Spur still under BNSF easement. Reactivation likely on grain cycle peak. Grade 1923 elevator has sound base and Fairbanks Moore scale, worth restoring. Corn export cycle turns up 1998. He did not show it to Rachel. He did not show it to Douglas. He kept it in his notebook. And that's when everything changed. Freight cycle knowledge in rail transportation, sometimes called institutional dispatcher memory, is the body of practical understanding that developed inside American railroads across generations of working staff. It captured patterns in commodity flow, tariff behavior, and branch line utilization that formal econometric models often fail to detect. When the great mergers of the 1980s reduced the number of veteran dispatchers still employed, much of this knowledge was lost to the industry itself and survived only in private notes kept by retired railroad men. Part 3. Now, here is what happened next, and I'm going to tell it to you the way it happened, in order, because the order matters. The first thing that went wrong was the rails. On the morning of October 14th, 1997, a certified letter arrived at the Meridian office in Kansas City from the corporate real estate division of BNSF Railway. The letter was 3 pages long and very polite. It notified Meridian Grain Partners that the Frisco corridor running through Cherokee County, Kansas, had been designated for reactivation under the 8-year infrastructure review. That field surveys of the corridor had been conducted the previous month, and that photographic evidence indicated that a segment of approximately 400 feet of track had been removed from the corridor without notice to the easement holder. The letter cited 3 federal statutes and 1 state statute. It requested restoration of the removed track to original specification within 180 days, at Meridian's expense, and included a schedule of daily penalties for each day past the deadline. The restoration estimate from the 2 contractors BNSF had already pre-approved came in at $220,000. The penalty schedule, if the deadline was missed, added another $110,000. Douglas Ramsey called Rachel Ivers into his office. Rachel called the 4 junior consultants. They sat around a conference table for 3 hours reading the letter, and nobody said anything for a while. And finally, Rachel said, in a very quiet voice, "The farmer came in and told us this in February." Douglas said, "I remember." Nobody in the room mentioned Nathan Osgood, sitting at his own desk down the hall, quietly turning to the page in his notebook from that same February morning and looking at the 4 lines he had written and closing the notebook again. The second thing that went wrong was the grain. The summer of 1998 was hot, and the corn crop across the Middle West came in strong, and the export flow through the port of New Orleans hit the highest tonnage since the mid-1980s. BNSF, exactly as Halvard Pettersson had predicted in his unpublished study 20 years earlier, was overwhelmed on its main lines. In the first week of August, the railroad issued a public tariff schedule that assigned a premium surcharge to any grain shipment loaded off the main corridors, and offered a discount tariff of $9 per ton to shipments loaded off reactivated secondary spurs. Meridian's new steel grain elevator, 4 miles from the nearest rail siding, had cost $680,000 to build over the previous winter. It was a beautiful facility. It had computerized loadout and modern moisture testing and everything a modern grain buyer could want, except access to the railroad. Meridian's trucks that fall hauled every bushel of harvested corn 4 miles east to the mainline station at Baxter Springs, paying a trucking cost of 31 cents per bushel above the standard rail tariff, while the 2 neighboring farmer cooperatives, both of which had elevators sited directly on reactivated spurs, paid 7 cents. On 700,000 bushels of corn, that difference came to about $168,000 in a single harvest. And the third thing that went wrong was the scale. Meridian's new elevator, in the middle of the harvest peak in the 3rd week of October of 1998, on its highest volume day of the season, had its computerized weigh system fail. The failure was traced later to a software update that had been installed the week before. 16 truckloads of harvested corn had been recorded at approximate weights while the vendor's technician drove out from Wichita. The corn was rejected by the buyer at the terminal in New Orleans for a certified weight discrepancy, and the entire lot had to be re-weighed at a competing elevator 12 miles away, at a fee schedule that had been quietly raised the previous month. The loss on that single incident came in at just over $140,000. Meanwhile, 3 miles west, the old wooden elevator on the former Ballard property, the one Meridian had scheduled for demolition, still stood untouched. The demolition had been held up in a review with the Kansas State Historical Society because someone at the county courthouse had flagged the building's 1923 construction date as potentially eligible for the state register. Inside its pit, under a layer of dust, the Fairbanks Morse platform scale sat exactly where it had sat for 75 years, quiet and cast iron and heavy as sin. When you added it all up, the rail restoration cost, the penalty schedule, the trucking premium across a full harvest, the weigh station catastrophe, and the general operating overrun, Meridian Grain Partners had absorbed losses of approximately $1,100,000 in 20 months and had missed roughly $400,000 more in freight discount revenue that had gone to the neighboring cooperatives instead. That is not a bad year. That is a catastrophe. Rachel Ivers drove out to the property on the last Friday of October, alone, and stood at the fence line with her arms folded and looked across at the wooden elevator standing in the low afternoon sun, and past it to the 400 feet of missing rail that had cost the company 1/5 of its total working capital. And she did not say anything for a long time. She just stood there in the cold Kansas wind with her clipboard hanging down at her side and looked at the ground. Now, here is where the story turns. Grain elevators sited directly on active rail spurs have historically enjoyed a decisive freight cost advantage over trucking-only facilities in the American Middle West. When rail carriers reactivate dormant secondary lines during export surges, the value of an existing on-spur elevator, even an aged wooden one, can exceed the value of a modern trucking-based facility located only a few miles distant. The economics of this asymmetry were well understood in the industry, but rarely modeled correctly in short-horizon investment analysis of the 1990s. Part 4. The man who drove up from Kansas City to walk the property in the first week of November of 1998 was named Warren Ellsworth. He was 64, a senior vice president, and unlike most people in the corporate office, he had grown up beside a railroad. His father had been a section foreman on the Rock Island line out of Enid, Oklahoma. He read the postmortem on the plane up and asked questions the report did not answer. He asked Douglas Ramsey who the local farmers were. Douglas mentioned Owen Pettersson almost in passing, a neighbor who had come in once in February of the year before with some concerns. Warren Ellsworth considered it significant. He asked Nathan what he knew about the neighbor. Nathan opened his notebook and turned to the page from that February morning. 4 lines written 20 months before the disaster. 4 lines that described with complete precision the 3 primary causes of the $1 million loss that a team of qualified Meridian analysts had just spent 6 weeks documenting. Warren Ellsworth looked at that page for a long time. Then he asked Nathan to take him to see the neighbor. Owen received them at his kitchen table the way he received everything, without performance. He poured coffee. He set out a plate of his wife's rye bread. He sat down across from Warren Ellsworth with his hands folded on the table, and he waited. Warren did not speak for the first 5 minutes. He drank his coffee. He looked at the framed photograph on the wall. Owen's grandfather beside a Frisco switch stand in 1911, his hand on the lever. He looked at the row of hardbound journals on the shelf above the counter, 17 of them. Then he said, "Mr. Pedersen, I would like to know what you know. I would like to know it slowly, in your own time, and in your own words." Owen looked at him and something in his face changed. Not a smile. Owen was not a smiling man, but a softening. The softening of a man who has been waiting for someone to actually ask the question. He talked for almost 2 hours. He talked about the Frisco easement and his uncle at the Pittsburgh dispatcher's desk. He talked about the wooden elevator and the Fairbanks Morse scale, and how the paperwork failed the first inspection every time, but the iron never did. He pulled down Halvard's journals and opened them to the bookmarked pages. 1966, 1974, 1982. 3 peak years. 3 matching surges in Frisco tonnage, all in the same square patient hand. Nathan wrote the entire time. When Owen was done, Warren Ellsworth was quiet for a long stretch. Then he said, "What would it take to have access to this on a formal basis?" Owen thought about it. He was 53 years old now. His own farm ran on patterns his family had set generations earlier. The country next door needed someone who could speak for it. He named a figure. Fair, not greedy. Warren Ellsworth did not negotiate. He said the contract would be in Owen's hands by the end of the week. "One condition," Owen said. Warren looked at him. "You listen." Not the way they listened in February of '97. Actually listen. Warren looked at him steadily. "Mr. Pedersen," he said, "that is exactly why I am sitting in your kitchen instead of asking Douglas to give you a call." Owen nodded once. He picked up his coffee. "All right," he said. "Let's start with the spur." The following spring, Meridian did 3 things differently. They restored the 400 feet of Frisco track within the 180-day window, avoiding the penalties. They pulled the demolition order on the wooden elevator and passed the Fairbanks Morse scale on its second inspection, exactly the way Owen had said it would. And they signed a preferred siting contract with BNSF at the discount tariff Halvard Pedersen had predicted 21 years earlier. They also hired Nathan Osgood full-time and told him to spend as much time with Owen as Owen would allow and to write everything down. The first freight train came up the reactivated Frisco spur on the 17th of June, 1999 at 7:22 in the morning. It was pulled by a BNSF locomotive in the new orange paint, and it carried 18 empty grain hoppers south from the main line at Baxter Springs to the wooden elevator on the old Ballard property. And it blew its horn twice as it came around the bend past the Hackberry stand, the way trains had always blown their horns in that country when Owen was a boy. Owen was standing at the fence line with a mug of coffee in his hand. He didn't wave. He just stood and watched, and the whistle carried across the prairie the way whistles used to carry. Nobody at Meridian called him a country simpleton anymore. They had learned at the cost of about $1.1 million that the most valuable knowledge on that 1,120 acres did not live in any econometric model and did not come from any business school. It lived in a quiet farmer down the road and in 17 journals on a kitchen shelf, the way it had lived in that country all along. In the front window of the Meridian Regional Office in Pearson, taped up next to the corn futures charts, there was a hand-drawn map on tracing paper. It showed the old Frisco corridor across Cherokee County, with the Ballard spur marked and the wooden elevator marked. And along the corridor, in careful block letters, reactivation window 1998 through 2001. Do not remove rail without notice to easement holder. The map was in Owen Pedersen's handwriting, and on the kitchen shelf 4 miles away, the row of journals had grown to 18. Warren Ellsworth asked Owen once, near the end of that first summer, sitting on the porch after supper, what the whole thing had taught him. Owen looked out across the prairie toward the tracks, where the evening light was catching the top of the wooden elevator. Then he said, in his even voice, Trains don't die. They just wait for somebody to remember why they came in the first place. That was the whole lesson, sitting right there in plain sight for anyone who had finally learned how to see it. The story of outside capital meeting local knowledge is one of the oldest stories in the American Middle West, and it has rarely ended well for the capital when the knowledge was ignored. What changed in cases like the one described here was not the knowledge itself. Owen Pedersen's understanding of that country was the same in 1996 as it was in 1999. What changed was who was willing to listen. The most expensive lesson in American agriculture and rail transportation has always been the lesson that a degree is not the same thing as having spent a lifetime paying attention to a piece of ground and the rails that ran across it.